Hi, I'm Chad with Move for a Guitar. This lesson is from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. In this lesson, I'm going to talk about the whole half diminished scale. First off, if you like the diagrams for everything in this series, including the diagrams for this lesson, you can download our free e-guide, Music Theory for Guitar. And this e-guide will be something that you can study and use as a reference for years to come. And like I said, it's free, so there's no reason not to just go download it. This is part 6.9 from our series, Music Theory for Guitar. If you'd like to go back and start at the beginning, you can click the link on the screen. So now that we've been looking at a couple scales that are apart from the major scale, they don't really have anything to do with the major scale except how we compare them back to get the intervals. They're standalone scales, they have their own modes. We're going to look at another one, and this one's different than the harmonic minor scale or the melodic minor scale. It's a more unique scale than those two scales, which we're going to talk about the differences through this lesson. And this is one of two really important diminished scales to understand, and the second one is actually just can be considered a mode out of this scale, but people really look at them as separate scales, which I'll talk about in these upcoming lessons. I'm going to really break down the differences between them. So the whole half diminished scale is built root 2, flat 3, 4, flat 5, sharp 5, 6, 7. So maybe you can notice right away that this is unique already because this doesn't have 7 notes like the other scales we looked at. We looked at pentatonics, which had 5, and the blues, which actually has 6, but that's different. It's really based on the pentatonic scale. This scale has 8 notes, so it's very unique from the other scales that have 7 notes. And because there's 8 notes, you actually have to double up one of the interval names. So usually when you're calling out a scale, you try to call it out in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Since there's 8 notes in this scale, you can't do that. You have to double one up. And I doubled up the 5, called it a sharp 5. I think that's the most important way to understand it, but you could call it a flat 6 as well. Or you could call this flat 5 a sharp 4. There's, they're just inharmonic equivalents. And so hopefully you can see that it looks very symmetrical, and that's because it's a symmetrical scale, meaning that the interval distances are the same all the way through. And the way you build it, these steps between the intervals are exactly what the name is implying, whole half. So you start with a whole step, then a half step, and then you just repeat that. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. That's all the scale does, whole steps and half steps, starting with a whole step, which is what the name implies. And this is a symmetrical scale because of that. Because these intervals are repeating symmetrically, it's a symmetrical scale. And hopefully you remember when we talked about symmetrical chords, it's basically the same kind of concept. The other scales aren't symmetrical, they're asymmetrical, they're irregular. The distances between the intervals aren't going in some sort of pattern that repeats over and over. This is repeating over and over. These patterns of whole step, half step just continually repeats all throughout the scale. And because of this, because it's symmetrical, because of the steps in the scale, it makes it a really unique scale, which we'll talk about in these upcoming lessons. There's quite a few things that are unique about it compared to the other scales. So if you're to build a triad out of this chord, you'll get a root, flat 3, flat 5, which obviously gives you a diminished triad, and what's on your screen is G in the key of G, so this would be a G diminished. And then if you were to build the 7th chord out of it, you would add in this 6 on top of the diminished triad. And hopefully you remember that a 6 is the inharmonic equivalent of a double flat 7 or a diminished 7th. So this 6 could actually be called a double flat 7, which in upcoming lessons I will call it that. I think it makes more sense with this scale, but a lot of people will label it out as a 6, so that's why I put it as a 6 in this lesson. So if we add in that 6, which is actually a double flat 7, we get a diminished 7th. Because you should remember from previous lesson that a diminished triad with a double flat 7 or diminished 7th interval gives you a diminished 7th chord, which on your screen is in the key of G, so that'd be a G diminished 7th chord. And this scale is really used for soloing over diminished 7th chords. That's going to be what you find it used for the most often by far. And so because this is a symmetrical scale, you end up with symmetrical patterns, meaning that you're going to repeat the patterns over and over. So there's multiple ways you could break this up into patterns. The way that makes the most sense to me is to start obviously with your root note, go root 2 flat 3, then go down towards the floor string to the 5th string, 4 flat 5 sharp 5 6, then down to the next string towards the floor 7 root 2, down towards the floor flat 3 4 flat 5, down towards the floor sharp 5 6 7, down towards the floor root 2, flat 3. So this kind of makes it compact, a little more easier to manage, because this can be kind of a hard scale to break up into patterns and manage these and visualize them when you're used to other types of scales. So you can use this as pattern 1, and then pattern 2 you could do this way, how I have laid out, just start on the second note and laid out this way, where you go 2, flat 3, 4, down towards the floor, flat 5, sharp 5, 6, down towards the floor, 7, root 2, flat 3, down towards the floor, 4, flat 5, sharp 5, down towards the floor, 6, 7, root down towards the floor, 2, flat 3, 4. And you'd end up with this shape, which is still fairly compact. And you can see that both of these patterns are just going 3 notes per string, except each of them have one spot that has 4 notes per string. So same with this second pattern, there's just one spot that has 4 notes per string and the rest are 3 notes per string. So it makes it a little easier to memorize. And if you look at the whole scale on the fretboard, both those patterns together would be right here. Pattern 1 would start right here, obviously. Pattern 2 would start right here. And then they share a lot of the same notes. And the nice thing about this being a symmetrical scale is that those are the only 2 patterns you need to learn. So you learn this pattern, you learn this pattern, and then you just repeat them over and over again. So your next pattern would be the same shape as this, and then so on. So if we looked at this as all the patterns broken up, here's your first pattern, which is what I showed you. Here's the second pattern that I showed you. Now you just repeat that over and over. Here's the first pattern again, the first fingering. You can see they're the exact same shape. And then this one is the same as this one, and so on. So you have this pattern, this fingering, this one's the exact same, this one's the exact same, and this one's the exact same. And then you have this pattern and fingering, this one's the exact same, this one's the exact same, and this one's the exact same. Obviously the intervals are different because you're starting at different intervals each time, but the actual fingering that you use, the actual pattern stays the same. So since it's a symmetrical scale, you have symmetrical patterns that just repeat over and over. So that's one way you could break the scale up into patterns. Another thing you could do, which is really common with the scale, is play it more horizontal. So instead of really breaking it up vertically, you could just take one long pattern horizontal. And a really common way to do that is to go just root 2, flat 3 on the 6th string, and then drop down to the 5th string towards the floor and go 4 notes per string. So then you go 4, flat 5, sharp 5, 6, and then just repeat that over and over again. 4 notes per string, and you can see it just drops down in the same spot each time, creating this shape. So it's really easy just until you get to the B string, and that's because the interval of the B string is different. So you just have to move up 1 fret and then repeat that pattern, 4 notes per string, and then do it again. And then I just ended it out going back to the root with 2 extra notes. So that's a really common thing to do with this scale, is to play it more horizontally that way, and you can play it pretty fast that way once you get used to it. So it's another nice reason, since it's symmetrical, you're just playing a pretty symmetrical pattern the whole way. The only reason it's not fully symmetrical is because of this B string being a different interval, so you have to jump up 1 fret. And because we started on the root, not the 7. If you started on the 7, then it'd be more symmetrical with 4 notes per string. So that's the whole half diminished scale. Go ahead and move on to the next lesson, where I'm going to talk about harmonizing this scale. And be sure to download the e-guide. All the diagrams are in there, and be sure to subscribe because we had at least one new lesson every day.